where we talked about the idea of Bitcoin getting a correction back to the bull market support band around the February timeframe. Okay. And the reason we said that is because it kind of goes in line with what we saw in Q3 of the pre-halving year. Breaking below the bull market support band happened every single time. Exhibit A, B, and C, and then it ended up happening once again right there. And so then the question posed yesterday was, will the pattern repeat of, and you might wonder, why am I talking about this? I'm going to try to explore it a little bit more. Will the pattern repeat here of going back into the bull market support band in February of the halving year? You can see that it occurred in 2012. It occurred in 2016 as well, right here. It also occurred in 2020. If you were to go look at 2020, it occurred as well. Now, what you'll notice is that in two examples, Bitcoin held the bull market support band, right? So like in 2012 and 2016, Bitcoin held the 20-week SMA and or 21-week EMA. But in 2020, it did not. It did not hold it. And so a lot of it ultimately comes down to whether the Fed engineers either a soft landing or a hard landing. Now, I will say, we could go below the bull market support band. I certainly would expect that if we were to drop to that level, I would expect the bulls to try to show up and try to hold it as support. They've been pretty successful at it so far. They did lose some ground right there, but then they gained it back. But there is another way to look at the market as well, and that not only do we normally go to the bull market support band, but we tend to retest the 100-week SMA at the very least at some point. And you can see that we got above the 100-week SMA in late 2015, and then we went back down to it in February of the halving year of 2016. And you can see that in the next cycle, after getting above the 100-week SMA, we eventually went back and tested it. Right? We actually, and you can see that we fell below the bull market support band when that happened. The point that I'm trying to make, at least in the last couple of cycles, is that once you get above the 100-week SMA, it would stand to reason that at some point in the months following it, you would go back and test it. Now, 2 cycles ago, when we tested the 100-week SMA, it was actually corresponding to the bull market support band. It was almost like we were handed off from the 100-week SMA to the 20-week SMA, right? You can see holding the 100-week and then holding the 20-week and then going up. But last cycle, that was not the case. The 100-week SMA was below the bull market support band, right? And so we ultimately went back down to it, and of course, we got a hard landing. And then this cycle, you can see that it's also below the bull market support band. Now, how much further below is it? Well, it's currently at around 28K, around 28K. So that should be something discussed as well. One of the things that, I know that it often happens, right? When you get a market that's trending for a long time, I think a lot of people just sort of assume that it'll never get a correction. And, frankly, Bitcoin has a way of going on and on and on a lot longer than people think it will, right? That we know that's true. Making them think that there will never be another substantial correction. And, I haven't seen a lot of that sentiment yet, but I have started to see a few comments where people are sort of saying that stuff. But I will say, it's one step at a time, right? It's, if we go to the bull market support band, then what? Do the bulls hold it as support or not? Again, history shows that once we get above the 100-week SMA, we tend to at least go test it at some point. And so, will that come into play as well? The other thing to think about is that after breaking out of a range, we tend to go back and test it at some point. You can see it even over here, right? Once we broke out of this range, we still went back and tested it at some point. So, when I look And even this range right here, right? You after you break out of it, at some point you tend to go back and retest it. So when I look at this chart, yes, there's the bull market support band. It's always possible we go below it. We'll see what the bulls can come up with, assuming we go that low. But there are some reasons to look at these types of wicks and think that it could be concerning. And again, I'm not saying that it has to play out in a specific way, but some of the things that we've discussed many times were retracing back up to the 618, which it is now done. That doesn't mean that it can't go higher, but if you look over here, it also retraced to the 618, right? And again, no two cycles tends to play out in the exact same way, so I do think that is somewhat relevant. But I think in the short term, if Bitcoin were to fall below the 8-week moving average and get a weekly close below it, that's where things start to get interesting. The reason for that, as we pointed out, is that getting below the 8-week moving average tends to lead us to the bull market support band. There's plenty of examples of it. Going below the 8-week takes you to the 20-week. Below the 8 takes you to below the 20 in this case, right? But it just keeps happening, right? If you go below the 8-week, you tend to go down the 20-week SMA. Go below the 8, go to the 20-week, 8, below the 20-week. So the 8-week moving average right now is 42,338. So we're only slightly above it. Only slightly above it. If we were to get a weekly close below it, then I think it really calls into question, okay, well, are we going to get that correction back to the downside? One of the things that I've mentioned for months, probably since October or November, was that in terms of seasonality, the next area, the next window of potential weakness in terms of that seasonality is about mid-January. Now, coincidentally, we got this long wick up January 11th, right? I mean, that's approximately mid-January. And so far, you could argue that we have had a correction, right? I mean, this has already been a 15% correction. So to some degree, I think we could say, all right, well, there has been a correction in mid-January. But that seems to some degree like a little bit of cope, if you will. At the end of the day, Bitcoin has not really put in a lower low, right? I mean, it just has been slowly trending higher. And so I think the question ultimately is well, okay, yes, it did get a 15% correction, but will it extend beyond that? Will it extend beyond that? Kind of like what we've seen over here. And one of the things you might notice with the 50-day moving average is that we've gotten below it 3 prior times, in the current cycle. And when you look at how much further we fell below it once we had a daily close below the 50-day, about 15%. Basically in every single example almost, somewhere between 13, 14, 15%. And that was still after we had a correction, just to get to that level in the first place, right? We already had substantial corrections just to get to that level in the first place. And so every single time, once we got below the 50-day, it's not like it immediately dropped, right? I mean, in all prior examples, there was some type of consolidation where Bitcoin tried to hold on for a while before continuing to sort of slowly go down. And even over here, it held on for a couple of weeks before it finally dropped. And so looking at where it is right now, you can see that we just had a daily close below it and then got back above it. And then now it's back below it again. If you look at the last time this happened, right, we actually had a very similar type of thing, right? We got below it, we got back above it. Then we sort of turned it down again, wick back up to it, and then we finally went down. If it played out like that, then it would still, the chop could still go on for a little bit longer before seeing some type of move to the downside. But one thing to note, again, all of these were about 15% drops from the current price, right, from the 50-day SMA or so. A 15% drop gets you to 36K. The reason why 36K is important is because that's basically smack dab in between the bull market support band. So the 20-week SMA is at 35.6K and the 21-week EMA is at 37K. So if we were to drop that 15% or so, that takes you back to the bull market support band. And that would be, the first line of defense for the bulls to try to hold. So all I'm trying to do is show people, guys, look, there's these patterns that emerge. And sometimes they play out and sometimes they don't. Back in Q3 of last year, we pointed out these moves by Bitcoin where in Q3 it tends to fall below the bull market support band. And a lot of people were like, well, that pattern's not going to play out, right? You should ignore it because this time is different. And while we did not put in a lower low, we still ultimately fulfilled the pattern of going below the bull market support band, just like we did here in Q3 of the pre-halving year, just like we did right there in Q3 of the pre-halving year, and just like we did right here in Q3 of the pre-halving year. So that time was in fact not different. So then what happens if it continues to not be different and at the very least goes back and tests the bull market support band? And if it still continues to be not different, then you could still easily make a case that you have to go potentially back down to the breakout point, which is all the way closer to 30K. And at 30K, assuming we go back there, could be an interesting level, because that level would sort of be, it would be the akin to, is it going to, or I guess it would probably correspond to, has the Fed achieved a soft landing or not? Because in 2 cycles ago, we held the 100-week SMA, and then we ultimately transitioned to holding the 20-week SMA, and that was when we had a recession scare, but we did not actually get one, right? So we more or less had a soft landing. I don't even know if you can call it that really, but last cycle it ended up being a hard landing. So I think to see how Bitcoin reacts to these key milestones is going to be important. How does it react at the 20-week SMA if and when we get there? How does it react to the 100-week SMA, which is slowly curling back up, right? It's slowly curling back up, and it wouldn't take too much longer for it to correspond to the prior breakout window. The thing that I find somewhat concerning, and I do feel compelled to say this because I said it last cycle, and I think it mostly fell on deaf ears in early 2021, and that was the 2.5 log line rule for the logarithmic regression rainbow that we've talked about. And the issue is that if you look from one cycle to another, it has dropped 2.5 log lines. And I can't help but wonder, this level that we've just printed, that is 2.5 log lines down, right? From here, half, and then 1, 2, it's 2.5 log lines down. Now, this log line here will be north of 100K by the end of 2025, right? So if you were to fast forward 2 years from now, this log line would be north of 100K. The problem is, have we gotten too extended too quickly? Have we gotten too extended too quickly? And you can see that not only did this wick go up to the 618, as we showed earlier, it also went basically perfectly up to that logarithmic regression line, which is also, by the way, where we went back over here. Bitcoin has a history of seeing that type of, respecting these levels. You can see that the 2019 rally ultimately topped out at that log line, and then it ended up dropping 3 back down to this level. Here we are, right, at that log line. And so, I can't promise a correction. I certainly can't promise anything. And a lot of it ultimately depends on, if Bitcoin drops below the 8-week moving average, right? Like if it actually drops below it. And so long as Bitcoin holds the 8-week SMA, then the bulls still have something going for them. But I think there is some reason. I think there is some reason to think that this wick could provide something formidable, at least for some period of time. I'm not suggesting that we can't go higher than that level for the next 2 years, but I am suggesting that, it's possible that we got a little bit too far extended in the short term, and need to cool off for a little bit. And during that cool off period, we'll figure just how strong, the market is, whether it can hold here, whether it goes down here, or if we follow the other log line rule, which is, you put in one low at one log line and then ultimately drop down to another log line later on in the cycle, right? I mean, we've seen that happen across these cycles where you go down to one log line and then, sometime later in the cycle, you visit another one, right here and right there. Sorry, yeah, right there and right there. Same thing over here, right? You go down to this log line and then sometime later you drop another one. So again, I can't promise if that's going to play out again or not, but so far we've gone to this one. And so if you sort of draw a line across the screen, this log line now corresponds to that prior level. So if that were to happen, right, if we were to drop 2 log lines down, then I imagine the altcoin market would get rinsed effectively. And I know a lot of people are going to say it's impossible and that, I should only talk about the upside, but it seems like everyone talks about that, right? I mean, we talked many times about Bitcoin retracing to the 618 level. I mean, how many times did we say, that's sort of a target, 48, 49K, 618 retracement. Also, the 2.5 log line rule would put it in that window for a correction. It also being mid-January where you have some unfavorable seasonality coming off of a big news event, the spot ETF, right? So it just seems like there's a lot of things that coincided, right? That all sort of coincided at the same point. Major news event, seasonality is unfavorable around mid-January for a little bit going into the halving year. Going up to the regression band and retracing to the 618, right? So all of those things make me think that there is a realistic chance here that we do, at the very least, repeat the pattern of returning to the bull market support band over the next few weeks, right? And that doesn't mean that it has to happen tomorrow. It doesn't even have to happen next week. Again, in a lot of the cycles, we didn't actually go back to the bull market support band until February, which is still a couple more weeks away. So I think it's important to think about, could still take a little bit of time to get there. I think the first thing you would need to see would be a weekly close below the 8-week moving average, right? A weekly close below the 8-week. We're already seeing some weakness on lower time frames. Now, of course, that could get reversed in an instant, but we are getting some daily closes here below the 50-day SMA. Bitcoin is struggling to hold on, and so if it keeps that up, then people might throw in the towel in the short term and say, all right, a correction it is. So that's what I'm looking at right now in terms of where Bitcoin, could be headed over the next couple of months. I don't really think it should be that surprising. I think that even people that are really, really bullish also would acknowledge, there's corrections, right? I mean, this is several 20% corrections at the very least in here. And so far, this has only been about a 14% correction, right? A 20% correction would take you all the way down to 38K. 38K could become important if by the time we correct, maybe that's where the bull market support band goes, right? So 38K sort of being right around here, you could guess, by say February, if Bitcoin were to fall in over here, that could be that level that the bulls try to hold, which, by the way, would also correspond to this breakout point right here, right? This area. So right there, Bitcoin was basically consolidating under this level, under 38K, finally broke out. I think that would be an interesting area, right? Over the next couple of weeks, if Bitcoin, does something like that and then falls back in. Or if it even wicks back up, right? If it even wicks back up and then falls down into this level. So just some speculation. Dubious, of course, as always. Just want people to understand there is downside risk here. There's always the potential upside. Crypto Twitter will let you know about that. But just understand what the risk is, and understand that if Bitcoin does get a flush down, then it would likely hit altcoins harder than Bitcoin. It would likely hit alts harder than Bitcoin would get hit if something like that were to happen, which has always happened in January, February of the halving year. And in 2 of the prior cycles, we held it as support. In 1 of the prior cycles, we had a hard landing, and we did not. So those are the risks. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up.